Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. It's time for Week 10 start sit. Of course, we're going to break this down into two parts so we can get really in depth. Not that many games this week. I believe we have 4 teams on bye, so going to be a little bit less talent, smaller talent pool. It's always nice when we get those bye weeks where there's only, say, 2 teams on bye. That's always nice. But that being said, there's still a ton of options out there, and really not a whole lot to say. If you have any questions or concerns or thoughts, whatever it may be, use the comment section down below. We'll do our best to answer you as soon as we can. And you know what? Let's just get right into it.
So I got game 1 Thursday night, Ravens versus the Dolphins. With the quarterbacks, let's break down Lamar Jackson. Right now, you look at Miami, they allow 6 most points to quarterbacks. Second in fantasy scoring among quarterbacks. So Lamar Jackson is just a guy that every week you're going to start. Now, here's the thing. Right now, it's kind of interesting. Last week, we had some teams in the NFL, had some off weeks, some of these better teams. We also had some quarterbacks last week that really laid some eggs. So, yeah, every once in a while, a great quarterback like that might have an off week. But Lamar Jackson's a guy that you got to start every week. Once again, Miami give him the 6 most points to quarterback. He's second in fantasy scoring amongst quarterbacks. Start him. Let's look at Tua and Brissett. Look at the quarterbacks from Miami. Coach Brian Flores came out and he said Tua, and this was as Tuesday that this came out. He's a game-time decision for Week 10. He said if the game were moved to Tuesday night, Brissett would start. So we don't know what's going to happen there. But here's what I would say. The Ravens' defense is not as strong as they have been in the past. They've had some struggles. They've been kind of, I would say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You never know what you're going to get. They had some games where they got torched by quarterbacks, and there's other games where they shut them down. Usually it's in direct proportion to the quality of the offense that they're playing. But in this case, it wouldn't matter. I'd sit both quarterbacks. One, Brissett hasn't been that great. And 2 is not 100%. He's got wide receivers that are out. So I would sit both guys. I would just try to avoid that if you can do that. Let's look at running back Gaskin. So you look at every week, he's had double-digit points in PPR scoring. But he carries risk in standard scoring. He just does. So he's a guy that, in PPRs, I feel comfortable on standards. There's some real hesitancy there. But I would say this week, he's your guy. I would start him in this one. But he has a limited ceiling there. Now, Ravens are giving the 11th most points to backs. So here's what I would say. I would say that he's a running back 2. He's a safe play in PPR scoring, but in standard leagues, he falls down to a flex or an RB3. Let's look at the running back situation for the Ravens there. So that one's a lot. You got Williams, you got Latavius Murray. If he comes back, I think he's not going to. Everything indicates he's not. He hasn't practiced all week. You got Freeman and Le'Veon Bell. Of all those guys, the one that's looked the best is Freeman. He's looked good. He's got 5.7 yards per carry. He's solid in the passing game. He's a veteran. They trust him. He's had touchdown 3 weeks in a row. So he's your guy. If you had to pick a guy out of that start, he's the guy that you would go with. But he does have a limited ceiling due to the fact that that offense, they spread the ball around. Alvin Lamar runs a lot. You got Le'Veon Bell in the mix there. And so, but some of you guys right now, because of buys and injuries, you're going to have to look his way. I picked him up as a security blanket just in case I need to start him. So here's what I would say. For him, he's a low-end running back 2 or flex. But in smaller leagues, and that's like a 10-team league or smaller, there's probably better options for you. But if you're a larger league than that, he's definitely a safer play in PPR scoring. As far as Bell goes, Bell looked solid last week. Le'Veon Bell looked pretty decent there. Brought you back to the years in Pittsburgh where he was good. But the touches are not consistent. And now, the one thing that could happen in this game, it could be a lopsided affair, meaning that they get more rushing attempts. But he's still far from trustworthy, so I would sit him unless you have no other option. You'd have to be pretty desperate to go that way. Now let's look at the wide receivers there. You got Brown and Bateman. Hollywood Marquez Brown, whatever his nickname is. And then you've got the rookie Bateman there. Now Brown's beginning to settle into a role I think is a little bit more what you can expect, a little more realistic. Earlier he was putting up wide receiver 1 type numbers, but now he's kind of falling into that wide receiver 2 category. And I think that's where you want to play this guy, and probably even down to 3 by the end of the year there. So that's where I would start him. I would start him as a wide receiver 2. Now, as Bateman, I would sit him in standards. Right now, I think he's a good wide receiver. I think he's got a bright future. I think he's building rapport, but he's just not there as far as stats go. So I would sit in standards. In PPR leagues, he's been solid. His targets have been decent, 6, and last week bumped up to 8 targets. But he's still far from a stud at this point. Now, Miami does give up the 3rd most points to wide receivers, so in many ways, that's a great matchup. But if Brissett starts this one, this could be a very lopsided game that's very low scoring, lowering the passing attempts and targets. That makes him a very, very low-end wide receiver 3 or flex. And that would have to be in leagues that are 12 teams or more. Under that, I wouldn't even play this guy. He falls to a wide receiver 4 there. As far as wide receivers go for Miami, a bunch of those guys are hurt on IR. The one guy, though, is Jalen Waddle. I know you like this guy, right?
Yeah.
I like him, too. I got him in Dynasty. Great hands. Now, you look at the Ravens, they're solid against the pass, but Parker's out, Fuller's out. He's gobbling up targets left and right. He's got good hands. He's very reliable. In PPR leagues, he's a solid wide receiver 2. Some have him a wide receiver 3, but I actually trust him as a wide receiver 2. Now, in standards, You need to drop him down to wide receiver 3 because he doesn't get a lot of yards, and he does have some touchdowns on the year, but he doesn't get a lot of red zone targets per se. As far as the tight ends go, you got Mike Gesicki and Mark Andrews. They are second and third in tight end scoring right now. Just start both of those guys. They're really good. Start Tucker. That guy is clutch kicker. That guy is the best kicker in NFL history. I would sit Sanders. Now, as far as defenses go, Miami allows the third most points to defenses. The Ravens have had, but the last 2 weeks, -1 points that defense has scored, the Ravens.
Yeah.
And they're 27th in fantasy scoring right now, the Ravens, so they're not your typical Ravens defense. But I would like them this week. I think you can start them, but you should temper your expectations, and I would sit Miami's defense in that game.
All right, now let's break down the Bills at the Jets. We'll start off with the Bills first. Now, they're coming off of a really embarrassing loss to the Jaguars. That team as a whole just did not look like they typically do. But that being said, and I think you'd agree with me, Rob, and let me know if maybe you don't agree with me, I think that tends to be a bit of a fluke. I think the Bills are going to be just fine. I think they're going to bounce back from that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so Josh Allen, starting off with him, plain and simple, you still need to start him. He had an off week, great, whatever, but he's still third in fantasy quarterback scoring. He's got weapons. He's very talented. You got to play Josh Allen, especially versus the Jets. They're not a great defense. Even in these last couple of games, right, last few weeks, we've seen some really big, really fun watch games from the Jets who've even competed with some good teams, but really they did that offensively. It still was not their defense. As far as the running backs go, Zach Moss. Now, here's the deal. He is 31st in running back scoring on the year. So typically that means he finishes just outside of a startable range. But when you include injuries, you include bye weeks, bad matchups, and things like that, yeah, he is a guy who's going to sneak into a lot of lineups, especially considering the Jets allowed the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. In fact, they've allowed 10 touchdowns to running backs in their last 3 games. So they have been very vulnerable. I think you absolutely must play Zach Moss this week. I think it's going to be a good week for him.
Yeah, now you're going to have to monitor. He is on concussion protocol. He didn't practice Wednesday. So obviously these things we say are conditional based on the information we have as of Wednesday. That could change. Obviously, if he sits, you sit, and that's a no-brainer. But you're probably getting to, if he sits, what kind of values are for Singletary, because that's the adjustment you would make. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's the funny thing as well. Singletary has been a little less productive this year, but he's also, when he's had the opportunities, he has found the end zone. And really, with how productive this Bills offense is as a whole, whoever the RB1 is in that situation needs to be started. Would you not agree with that?
yeah, I agree.
So if Moss is out there, I would sit Singletary. If Moss is out, you need to start Singletary, as he's going to see a lot of touches. In fact, Singletary might have more volume than Moss if they both play, because there's not going to be any running back there, any running back 2 to take touches away from him. So he might actually see a little more volume, if that makes any sense. As far as the wide receivers go, it's pretty simple. You got to start Stephon Diggs as a wide receiver too. The Jets do give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but that's not really a product of them having a good defense. It's one, simply how bad they are against the run, and 2, teams other than the last couple of weeks have not needed to score a lot of points against them. So that's pretty obvious there. Now, getting into some other positions, what about some other wide receivers at that position? What about Cole Beasley? In PPR leagues, you can play him as a wide receiver 3. He has 33 targets and 25 catches over his last 3 games. But I will clarify this: if Dawson Knox returns, you do need to lower his volume or his value down then to a wide receiver 4. I would sit Emmanuel Sanders. And speaking of Dawson Knox, when Dawson Knox returns, he is a stud. He is a tight end 1. He is super productive. He had, 5 touchdowns in the 4 games before he got hurt. He's great. But he is questionable right now, and as when I last looked into it, we had pretty much no research or no information on whether or not he would end up playing this week. There is a chance. I imagine he'll be out for another game, as they're going to play it slow. This is a team that's competing for a Super Bowl here, so they don't want to rush him back. You also need to start Tyler Bass, the kicker. He is number 1 in fantasy scoring. And I'd start the Bills defense this week. I think they're going to have a good week. Even in last week, they had a off week. They still held the opposing team to just 9 points. So even in a bad week for them, their defense was just fine. Taking a look at the other side, really, you got to sit whatever quarterback starts for the Jets. The Bills allow the fewest fantasy points to opposing QBs. To me, that seems pretty straightforward and simple. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
As far as the running backs go, Michael Carter, you need to start Michael Carter. He is 19th in running back scoring, making him a solid RB2, but he really had a slow start to the year where he was very underutilized. He might even be a high-end running back too. Now, you do need to temper your expectations this week in particular, as the Bills give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. In fact, only Derrick Henry has a rushing touchdown versus the Bills defense this year. He did have 3, but it's Derrick Henry. He's the only guy to do that. So Michael Carter, you got to start this guy. I would just lower your expectations. He's not going to be quite as good as he will other weeks. Another running back to keep your eye on, I wouldn't start him, but Ty Johnson's actually been productive recently too. In fact, he is 37th in running back scoring on the year, so he's typically right on the cusp. Now again, when you include bye weeks and injuries, there's a lot of weeks where he's going to sneak in as a starter for you. That being said, this is not the week. As far as the wide receivers go, it seems really straightforward to me. I would start Elijah Moore. He was the #1 wide receiver in fantasy scoring last week. Now, this is going to be a much tougher week. Yet again, the Bills giving up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but they have allowed some big performances to, say, Devontae Parker, had 8 catches for 85 yards, but that's really a testament to how good the Bills defense is. Devontae Parker had the best game that any receiver has had versus the Bills, and he didn't score a touchdown. That tells you how dominant those defensive backs are. As far as the other wide receivers go, Corey Davis is questionable but likely to return. And then Jamison Crowder, he's a fair volume play if Davis is out. Ultimately, you got 3 wide receivers there. There's a lot of names to kind of go around and spread the ball around in a tough matchup. I'd probably say to go ahead and if you need an upside play, maybe you can start Elijah Moore, but I'd probably sit all 3 of these wide receivers. Again, you got question marks at who's going to play quarterback for you this week. You have a really tough matchup, and you're going to be spreading the ball out amongst a ton of weapons. Do you feel like any of those guys you're really confident starting this week?
No, I mean, if you're in a really large league, you could look at somebody like Crowder, maybe PPR flex. I don't know. Looks like White's probably going to be the quarterback. I think that's a good call at this point. But yeah, I mean, that Bills defense is really good. This could be an ugly weekend for the Jets. So.
Yeah, I would sit the tight ends there. Croft is their tight end 1, but he is out this week, means the backup Griffin will see a few more plays, a few more snaps and targets, but I don't think you can trust him. I would also sit Matt Amendola and the Jets defense as well.
I've got the BUCS versus the Washington football team. So with quarterback Tom Brady. So Washington was supposed to be a good defense this year, young, upcoming, some thought even maybe top 5. They have been far from that. In fact, they allow the most points to quarterbacks. And Tom Brady right now is #1 quarterback in scoring. So that's a perfect storm. Start Tom Brady. You should feel very confident there. Let's look at Tyler Heineke. Tampa Bay is another defense that's kind of disappointed a little bit right now. They're allowing the 8th most points to quarterbacks. Now, you look at Tyler Heineke. He's had 3 solid fantasy games this year. But the last 3 games, I should say, but in the last 4 games, he's only had a total of 3 passing touchdowns. So he started off decent, but now he's regressing a little bit there. Now, I do think in this game, they'll have to play catch-up, probably throw the ball a lot to keep up with Tom Brady. So in a pinch, you could start him as a sleeper. One of the things that would make me even feel more comfortable with him as a sleeper role. Now, once again, he's not a guy that I would say is going to be a quarterback 1, but if you're like in daily fantasy or if you're in a 2-quarterback league, that's if Logan Thomas returns a tight end, a weapon that he relies on quite often. Looks like he could play. If that does, it's a big boost. So once again, Heineke is a guy that if you need a sleeper in a very large league, go for it. But I only like the fact that it's a volume play. As far as trusting Tyler Heineke, is a guy that I don't fully trust there.
Yeah, I don't think he's a player I'd start trusting in a regular league, but maybe you want to take a gamble in a daily fantasy league. That's something I might do.
Exactly. Let's look at the running backs. Let's talk about Gibson. He's been playing through a shin injury there. Now, although last game he only had 8 carries, but he did take the buyout. Hopefully that's another chance for him to get healthy. He rested up. Another thing that's hurt him a little bit is McKissick. McKissick is very solid in the passing game. That reduces his PPR value as far as Gibson goes and lowers his floor. With all that said, yeah, he hasn't been as productive. He's had an injury. He's still 18th in back scoring. Now, the first 4 weeks, and 3 of the first 4 weeks, he had double-digit points. But the last 3, he's been below 10 points in PPR scoring, and he's trending down. And I also have a concern because of the injury and the fact that they're going to be playing catch-up. I have a feeling they're not going to be able to stick to the run, which means they're going to have to rely more heavily on McKissick in the passing game there. So for me, you still got to consider this guy, if he plays and he's healthy, as a low-end running back too, because you probably don't have a better option, but definitely not the guy that you expected coming into the year when he's 100% and healthy there. As far as McKissick goes, this guy is great in PPR scoring. I think he's going to get a lot of targets in this game, probably 8 to 10, playing catch-up. I would actually start him in PPR scoring as a flex play or a running back 2 if you're in a league 16 teams or larger. Leonard Fournette, he's the only running back I would start right now for the Bucs. Now, last game he got shut down by the Saints, but the Saints have the number one run defense in the NFL. Go ahead and play Leonard Fournette. He should be okay in this one. In fact, he should get a lot of carries in what will probably be a blowout. As far as tight ends go, I would consider Logan Thomas. I would start him if he's okay. If he comes back, they're going to definitely rely upon him. And then Gronkowski. So here's the thing. He's back and forth, but they came out today. They said they're concerned about his health. I don't think he's going to play. If he does play, I think they're going to limit his field time. Like you said earlier, they're playing for a Super Bowl, and they can win without this guy. So I don't see that he's a guy that's probably going to play, and even if he did, I'd probably sit him. Now let's take a look at the wide receivers there. So let's start with Tampa Bay there. So it sounds like they're still going to have, looks like Gronkowski's probably going to be out. Brown's probably going to be out. And that leaves Godwin and Evans. Well, I tell you what, this is a great matchup. I would start both of those guys as wide receiver ones. They should have big games. As far as wide receivers go for the Washington Redskins, my guy, like I always got a mad
The
crush
Washington
on.
football team.
I know, the Washington football team. I always get that wrong. It's just killing me. It's just killing me. But you'll have grace for me, right? So let's go to the Washington football team wide receivers there. I got a mad crush on Terry McLaurin. I love this guy. He's a great wide receiver there. Would be even better if he had more consistent quarterback play. But you got to start him in this game because he's probably going to see 12 to 14 targets playing catch up. Start him as a wide receiver one. As far as the Western wide receivers go on that team there, it's hard to pin down anybody. I would probably stay away from the rest of those guys there. As far as kickers go, I think Suckup is a solid play, but not a great play. And Sly, if you had to start, one's a low-end start as far as a kicker go for Washington there. But here's the problem with that game against Washington is field goals are not going to keep you in that game. They're going to need extra points, so I'd probably sit Sly. I would sit Washington's defense. Now, the Bucs defense, they've had 4 great games and 3 very disappointing games in fantasy. They're high risk, high reward. But Washington allows the 10th most points to defenses, and they're giving up sacks more frequently the last few games, so I would start the Bucs in this one. That's what I would do. Any thoughts on that?
No, pretty straightforward breakdown. Going to be a fun game to watch. And yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't see any benefit to the Buccaneers playing Gronkowski this week. I don't know about you, but I think they'd be pretty dumb to put him out on the field. All right, next up, let's get into the Falcons at the Cowboys. And I want to talk about the Cowboys first because I think we can get extremely biased and confused very quickly, even when it comes to stats. I saw somebody post this, and it blows my mind. They said that they're worried about Dak Prescott's fantasy value, and I thought, what? They
Trade to me.
They said, well, he had an off week last week. In fact, the Cowboys as a whole had an off week, and he's 14th in fantasy points amongst quarterbacks this season. And then, first of all, last week in his off week, he still finished 11th in fantasy quarterback scoring, so he was still a startable QB, and he's missed games due to injury. He is second in fantasy points per game behind only Tom Brady, putting up 26 points a game. So this is one of those reasons. This is why we started a fantasy football channel. Sometimes it just feels like you can't trust anybody on the internet.
Yeah.
But another great thing versus the Falcons this week, giving up the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, Dak Prescott is a must-play quarterback.
Well, let's just talk for a second. Last week, what quarterbacks laid an egg out there? There's a lot of them that were injured, couldn't play. Aaron Rodgers was out. Kyler Murray was out. Josh Allen struggled. Matthew Stafford struggled. I mean, we go down the list. Like, all these great quarterbacks have had an off week. Mm-hmm. If you don't trust a guy like that, what are you going to go with? Trevor Siemian? Probably not. I tell you what, trade Dak to me. I'll play him.
Yeah, seriously. And you know what? It really starts across the board for this Cowboys team that is just very effective offense. You got to start Zeke. Great fantasy running back, RB1, and the Falcons give up the 6th most fantasy points to running backs, so that's great. What about the wide receivers? Both Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb are top 24 in receiver scoring, and the Falcons have given up 4 touchdowns to wideouts in their last 2 games. They've been very vulnerable there, so start them. Oh, yeah, and what about Dalton Schultz? Now, he's a solid volume guy. Hasn't seen a lot of touchdowns recently, but he's a safe pick to get you 7 or 8 targets and 5 or 6 catches, so PPR value is there. He's a safe play, and the touchdowns could very well end up being there this week. Here's the thing. The Falcons are very middle of the road as far as fantasy points allowed to tight ends, but they've only seen 3 good tight ends this year. Dallas Goedert, Rob Gronkowski, and Mike Gesicki. All 3 of those guys scored and had great fantasy weeks versus them. So you know what? I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Schultz score this week. I think he's a great play. I would sit kicker Greg Zuerlein, and I would sit the Dallas's defense. Now, they have been trending down as far as their fantasy value as of recently. As far as the other side there goes, we'll talk about the Falcons offense. What about Matt Ryan? He's actually not a bad play this week. As far as top 12 finishes, He has finished top 12 in fantasy quarterback scoring 3 of the last 4 games. In fact, he was number 2 quarterback just a couple weeks ago. And he's got 3 300-yard passing games. He has 2 touchdowns in at least 7 of the last 8 games. He's looked really well. I actually think you can play Matt Ryan in a game like this where they're probably going to need to score a lot of points to keep up with the Cowboys.
Yeah, another note on Greg Zuerlein there. Not only did you say sit him, but he's in COVID protocol right now. Unlikely he's going to clear in time to play in that game, so that just makes it really easy for you.
All right, so moving on there, just broke down Matt Ryan. What about other players for the Falcons? Mike Davis, he is 34th in running back scoring, and he doesn't have a high ceiling either. Here's one where you see a guy who basically is a running back 3. When you include injuries, when you include bye weeks, when you include other players who have tough matchups, things like that, typically a running back, at 31 or 32 might sneak into your lineup. Mike Davis has such a low ceiling that even if I just wouldn't play him pretty much no matter what, because you're really not getting a lot of value there. He's getting a few touches here or there, but there's not a lot of fantasy value there at all.
Yeah, that's going to be a major offseason move. In fact, the Falcons have snuck back in contention, and I think one of the things they could have, I know they've used Cordell Patterson in that role quite a bit, but Cordell Patterson's having a great year, but his metrics as far as running the ball haven't been that great, and Mike Davis hasn't been that great. They could really use a bona fide running back there. I'm surprised they didn't make a move for one, but...
And speaking of Cordell Patterson, he's a must-start. 7th in running back scoring in PPR leagues. Had another monster performance last week. In fact, I was curious about it because, he's seeing a lot of catches, right? He's doing a lot in the passing game. He's more of a wide receiver than a running back. He's basically a wide receiver who happens to get 9 or 10 carries a game. If that's not true, I don't know what is. But so I thought, what's his standard league scoring? He must have dropped value in that, right? He's still 9th in standard league scoring. So really, he's just fine no matter what league you're in. I do want to clarify that. As far as the other wide receivers go, because Patterson really is a must-start there. Russell Gage, here's one that I think a lot of people are going to be afraid of. I would start Russell Gage this week as a wide receiver 3. He's finished top 20 in weekly scoring 2 out of the last 3 games. The one week he played bad was the week they lost Calvin Ridley, and let's be honest, that offense as a whole struggled. They were clearly out of step, just as an entire unit. Now, the Cowboys give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. I think he's going to have a good week this week.
Yeah, another thing to add to that, you never know how much this is coach speak and what's going to really happen there. But the Cowboys came out today and said that they're really concerned about Kyle Pitts. They're going to give him a lot of attention. And we know why. This guy is an all-world athlete, unbelievable talent. But if they give him extra attention, you know what that's going to mean? Shifting targets to somebody. And some of that, Gage will be a benefactor of that. So.
Here's what's interesting. The Cowboys have allowed every good tight end they faced to score touchdowns against them. They have been vulnerable. And here's what really surprised me. Since week 4, when Kyle Pitts had his, coming out party where he just emerged. So since week 4, over the last 5 weeks, he is the number 1 tight end in fantasy scoring, even better than Travis Kelce. Man, wish we could have gotten that guy when we made trade offers for him.
I tried to give up everything for the guy. Nobody would bite. And honestly, I was allowing myself to even be ripped off. So, yeah, this guy's going to be a phenomenal tight end in the years to come.
So I would play Kyle Pitts this week. I would sit their kicker, Younghoe Koo, and I would sit the Falcons defense as well.
So I've got the Saints versus the Titans. I want to talk about the Tennessee Titans. I tell you what, the last 5-6 weeks, they look very, very scary. That team is one. They're looking like they're legitimate contenders. They got to be top 3 in terms of like your NFL power rankings, I would guess. I don't know. But anyways, I digress there because this is not a rankings. This is a fantasy football video. They shut down the high-power Rams. Now, if you look at quarterbacks versus the Titans, look at Kyler Murray and Josh Allen had big games against them. But one, Trevor Siemian is not that talented of a quarterback. The other thing those two quarterbacks have in common is they're mobile quarterbacks. Trevor Siemian is not a mobile quarterback. Even though he has filled in nicely for Winston, I would sit him in this game against the Titans. The defense, by the way, that's getting better and better, putting more pressure on the quarterback. I would sit them. Look at what they did against the Rams. So, as far as Ryan Tannehill goes, he didn't do much against the Rams that game points-wise, but part of the reason why was game flow. He didn't need to do that much. They had a couple of interceptions early on. They got ahead early, and they really controlled that game all the way to the very end. If Rams scored a late touchdown, it was kind of inconsequential at that point.
Yeah.
I also think they're going to lean more heavily on the passing game, especially with Jones healthy right now and Brown healthier. I think those two together lean more heavily on the passing game. Now, the Saints did shut down Aaron Rodgers week 1, but 3 of the last 5 weeks, Matt Ryan, Tom Brady, and Daniel Jones lit them up. The two quarterbacks that didn't light them up that struggle was Tyler Heineke and Geno Smith. They struggled, but once again, that's Heineke and Smith. Not great quarterbacks there. I actually would start Tannehill as a high-end quarterback, too. He's not top 12, but he's right outside there. I actually would start him against the Saints because the one thing that they're going to do is they're going to struggle to run the ball, as we're about to find out, and they're going to have to throw the ball more. So look at the running backs for the Titans. You got Peterson, McNichols, and Foreman. The Saints' run defense is very, very good. Number one in the NFL. They allow only 73 yards per game. They allow the fifth fewest points to running backs. Now, they will allow some fancy points to backs, but it's mostly in the passing game, which Adrian Peterson, that's not a strength of his. So that puts McNichols really in the best position of the three backs. Also, it could just be Russ, but if you watch that game, Adrian Peterson didn't look good. Now, let's give him a couple more weeks to get back in that offense, to get involved, etc. But 10 carries for 21 yards is not good. He did have a touchdown to save his day. Now, Foreman actually ran well there. Maybe he ran the best of the three. But here's what I would do with all three of those backs at this point. I would sit all three if you can afford to do that so we can assess that situation a little bit better, have a little better matchup there. If you have to play one, if you're forced, McNichols in PPR scoring league or Peterson in standards leagues, but only if it's a large league, 14 teams or larger. So that's kind of what I would do, but try to sit all three if you can. Let's look at the running backs for the Saints. Alvin Kamara, their best weapon by far. Not just their best running back, their best weapon hands down. We know he's a good running back, but right now he's first on the team with catches, first on the team in receiving touchdowns, and he's second in receiving yards, only 13 yards behind Harris. You need to start him every week. He's an RB1, top 5 every week. The only concern you have if you own Alvin Kamara at this point is injuries, durability, taking that much wear and tear long term. So anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, really straightforward. I love what you said about Simeon there. Yeah, the Titans, first of all, their defense is getting a lot better, and they have allowed some big fantasy points to quarterbacks, but Simeon is not Josh Allen. He's not Kyler Murray. You even mentioned it earlier before we recorded this. Those are mobile quarterbacks, and that really allowed them to do some things that, pocket presence quarterbacks just can't do versus the Titans. So, and they've got better wide receivers, which is also probably, important to remember there. So, I think great breakdown. It's going to be a fun game to watch. I'm really curious to see how long the Titans can keep it up while they don't have Derrick Henry. You feel like defenses have got to figure out that offense, but for now, they really are one of the best teams in football.
Yeah, I think the one thing that they struggle with as far as teams go, Titans at times have played well. Tannehill's had some good stretches. We talked about in our last video. The one thing they seem to struggle is their defense, but they seem to figure some things out there. And so I think they're going to be all right down the stretch there. Look at Mark Ingram. Mark Ingram came back, put on the Saints uniform, looked well there. Michael Thomas is now gone for the year, and Winston's out. So I think he's going to carve out a nice role every week. Even though we know Alvin Kamara is the number one guy, I think Ingram's going to have value there. I think weekly he's going to see 5 to 8 carries, 5 to 6 targets per game, and making somebody you could consider playing as a flex play in PPR scoring. But against the Titans defense, also against a defense that's getting better and better each week, I would probably sit Ingram this week, just one more week to see exactly what that role is going to look like there. Julio Jones and A.J. Brown, once again, always monitor injury reports. Seems like every week Julio Jones is questionable, rarely 100%. But if they play, you would start both of those guys as a wide receiver. I would tell Brown as a wide receiver 1 and Jones as a wide receiver 2. The Saints give up the 4th most points to wide receivers. They shut down the running game, which forces teams to pass. So I think that plays well for them. Sit all tight ends in this game as far as kickers go. Johnson and Bullock are both startable kickers, not great plays, but definitely not bad plays in this one. And I would start the Titans defense, who suddenly have a strong pass rush. They've scored double-digit points 3 of the last 4 weeks on defense there, and I would sit the Saints defense in this game.
All right, now I'm going to break down the Jaguars at the Colts. Let's start off with the Jaguars and Trevor Lawrence. We talked about it earlier a little bit with the Bills, but what a surprising performance by the Jaguars last week to get a win against the Bills. But it's really a testament to how bad Trevor Lawrence is for fantasy when they finally go out there and have this crazy upsetting win and they still only scored 9 points. I mean, that to me really tells you everything you need to know. He has just one top 12 weekly finish. He's 23rd in scoring. You got to sit Trevor Lawrence. It's really that simple. As far as the running backs go, James Robinson. Now, the head coach there, Urban Meyer, said that he, with that heel injury, is expected to play this week in Week 10. So that's very exciting to see when he bounces back. He's going to be just fine. In the 4 games before he got hurt, he had 5 touchdowns and was top 6 in fantasy running back scoring. James Robinson is a running back 1 when he is healthy. He is a must-play guy. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. This guy's so underrated.
Of course, if for some reason he doesn't play this week, which it looks like he will, you could play Carlos Hyde. I would actually choose to sit him either way, though. Last week, despite seeing 23 touches, he was 38th in weekly running back scoring. Carlos Hyde is just not effective. It's really that simple. As far as the wide receivers go, I'm going to sit all Jaguars wide receivers. Here's the thing. Their highest scoring fantasy receiver this year is Marvin Jones. Here's the thing with that. He has finished 53rd or worse in weekly scoring 4 out of his last 5 games, and he is their most valuable fantasy wideout. It tells you all you need to know.
They drafted Travis Etienne, and a lot of people thought, what are they doing there? And there's a lot of talk out of camp that they're trying to use him a lot in the wide receiver position, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But now you look at the ineptitude of their wide receivers, they definitely need help there in the offseason. And maybe Travis is that guy that can line up. I don't know, but they've got to figure something out there. You've got a good young running back, they got a good young quarterback there, but you need some wideouts. So.
Yeah, the one guy who is productive in the passing game is their tight end, Dan Arnold. 17 targets and 12 catches, averaging 64 yards over his last 2 games. In fact, in week 8, he was the number 2 fantasy tight end in all scoring there. I would actually play Dan Arnold. He is a solid PPR volume play. Not a great, not a safe touchdown guy there, so in standards, bump him down, but I would still play him. I'd sit their kicker, Matthew Wright. And I'm going to sit the Jaguars defense. Before last game, they were averaging 2 fantasy points in 4 straight games. It was not productive. Taking a look at the other side, let's talk about the Colts there in Carson Wentz. This is a guy who I think you need to play. He's got tons of fantasy value, and he's been really turning it on recently. Remember the first couple weeks of the season, injury to Wentz, injury to their offensive line. They had a lot of problems to start the year. But he is 8th in fantasy quarterback scoring. In fact, since week 5, so the last 4 games, he is number 2 amongst quarterbacks in scoring. He's got back-to-back games with 3 touchdowns, 6 games with at least 2 touchdowns. He is very, very productive. In fact, in the last 6 games, his worst performance was 17 fantasy points. How do you complain about that? Definitely play Carson Wentz. You also need to play Jonathan Taylor. He is the number 1 running back in fantasy scoring. In fact, here's his last couple performances, I believe his last 6 games. 22 points, 34, 31, 24, 21, and 41 points. It's easy to see why he's the number 1 running back in fantasy scoring. You need to start him. Another guy who's turned it on recently, I picked him up actually off of waivers, is Michael Pittman. He has been a nice surprise. He is the wide receiver 7 in scoring. In fact, he is the wide receiver 3 in scoring since week 5. He has really turned it on recently. Michael Pittman, it's not too much of a surprise. This guy who's a fairly early draft pick, he's got a good size to him. He's a very solid possession receiver, and he's got great chemistry with his quarterback.
Yeah, a guy, I believe, 2nd-round pick. He's 6'4", big target, you name it. I mean, it's surprised that people overlooked him. We talked a lot about him in the preseason. Shocked to see he was so available in waiver wires in so many leagues, especially in dynasty leagues, which is where you got him.
Yeah.
Very confusing that people overlooked him, but he's a very undervalued wide receiver.
Yeah, but hey, I'll take it. Break it down nice and simple here, going straight through the rest of this. I'm going to sit all other wide receivers for the Colts, right? I mean, there's just no one else there has consistent production that you can really trust. As far as the tight ends, I'm going to sit both Moali Cox and Jack Doyle. You can start Michael Badgley as a safe but low-end play. He's going to get you about 7 to 9 points, and he's very consistent, but there's not a lot of upside there. Considering if you've watched our waiver wire videos, you know the options you have available to you. I'd probably sit him, but he doesn't need to be sitting in deeper leagues. There is some value there. I know that Blankenship right now, I don't think that he will be kicking this week. Let's talk about the Colts real quick. I would start them versus the Jaguars. They're allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Colts defense, they got a little bit inconsistency, but they're a fairly solid all-around defense. So I would definitely keep that in mind that they've been fairly productive recently. Rob, I know you're looking into checking that out real quick. You seeing anything? I know Blankenship is on the IR.
Yeah, it looks like I'm not seeing anything that's saying he's going to come out at this point. You can monitor that. But yeah, even before that, he had some struggles kicking the ball. So even if he does come back, you probably want a week anyway. So
yeah.
My final game on this first part, once we do 2 parts, we'll do a waiver wire, not waiver, but it starts the video part 2. But the final game for me today, anyways, is the Lions versus the Steelers. Start with Jared Goff. Steelers defense is solid. Goff has had struggles the last 4 games. He lacks a lack of weapons. I mean, I could go down the list of reasons, choose your reason why, whether it be the defense, lack of weapons, his struggles lately. Just sit Jared Goff in this game. As far as Beth Roethlisberger goes, Big Ben's been playing better lately. It's not lights out, it's not amazing, but he's doing just enough to win games. Concern I have is Juju Smith is out, and Chase Claypool is questionable. He's banged up. In fact, last game he actually missed a couple of snaps. He was sitting on the sideline, they're working on him, so he's kind of not 100% at this point. And I also think it'll be a lower scoring game as the Steelers should win this one somewhat easily, and they'll play it conservatively. So I think that's what's going to happen. I would sit Ben Roethlisberger in this one. As far as running backs go, Najee Harris, his efficiency hasn't been good. Right now, he's got 3.6 yards per carry. That's not his fault. It's the offensive line there. But it doesn't matter. Even though he's not efficient, his volume is great. He's getting goal line carries. He's getting targets in the passing game. In fact, he's got 6 touchdowns in the last 7 games. He's on pace for 80 catches. So start as a running back 1 versus the Lions. As far as the running backs go for the Lions, Swift, in standard scoring, he's nothing to write home about. He carries a lot of risk in standards. But he's also another running back who's on pace at his current pace for 94 catches, highly used in the passing game. That makes him a strong running back 2 in PPR league play. You can play him in that and feel confident in that there. As far as wide receivers go for the Steelers, Deontay Johnson, he's really Ben's go-to guy at this point. He's been solid week to week. Now, he's had double-digit points scoring every week except 1 week that he was hurt. So he's a guy that you can play. In fact, I would play him as a very strong wide receiver 2 in PPRs. I would drop him down to a low-end wide receiver 2 in standard scoring. Now, Chase Claypool, here's a guy who's got a high ceiling but a lower floor. He's got a lower floor because, one, he's banged up right now. He plays in a low-volume offense. And Big Ben, in my opinion, for what it's worth, he seems like he's lost some arm strength. I've seen routinely underthrowing Chase on a lot of things where he's wide open. You know, he's had to make some spectacular athletic plays to come back and get the ball over defenders if Ben just had a little bit more on there. So if you take a look at that, to me, I like Chase Claypool. I like his potential, but you have to consider those things I mentioned, lower him down to a wide receiver 4. As far as wide receivers go for the Lions there, you look at Hawkinson and Swift, they're getting a lot of the targets there, and I don't really trust any of the wide receivers for the Lions at this point. Now, maybe as the year goes on, one of those guys distance themselves or develops, but right now I would avoid all Lions wide receivers. As far as the tight ends go, these are young and up-and-coming tight ends. Okay, Hawkinson right now is 5th in tight end scoring, and then another guy that you like there for Pittsburgh that's looking better and better, he's another one that I know you picked up in Dynasty, and that is
Pat Freiermuth.
Yeah, this guy's really looking good. Now, earlier we kind of liked him in the preseason, but you can see the rapport he's developing with Ben there. The last 3 weeks, Pro Football Focus ranks him as number 3 tight end. He's had 3 touchdowns in 3 weeks, so the guy's looking better and better and better. I like both of these tight ends. I would start both of them in this matchup there. I would start Boswell, the kicker. I would sit the Lions kicker. And I would start Pittsburgh's defense. I would sit the Lions defense in this one. Pretty straightforward. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I love that. It's that straightforward. There's not a lot of question marks there as far as fantasy value goes for a lot of those guys. Really straightforward. You know, the tough thing with the Pat Freiermuth one is the touchdowns, 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. You know, it's really hard to depend on touchdowns. But if there is a position you can reliably be touchdown dependent, it's probably tight end, right? I mean, we even saw late in his career, Jimmy Graham, right there playing for Seattle. He had like 8 touchdowns in 8 games. Why? I don't know. It's come down to the way that teams use their tight ends. They get into the red zone. They see a lot more volume.
Well, and then if Chase Claypool misses any time, you had Juju Smith stuff, those targets, he's going to see a few more targets there. So that will also, you have to monitor that. That could bump down to lower his value. But yeah, he's a guy that I like.
All right, so talking about my last game for this video, Browns at Patriots. I want to talk about the Patriots first because I really want to talk about Mac Jones. Now, we might be getting a little bit away from fantasy here, but I got a question for you. And, you know, I've kind of been a fan of him. I've kind of been rooting for him and rooting for the Patriots. But, you know, just because I think part of it would be hilarious if they drafted another franchise quarterback and were good for another decade and everyone was really mad about it. I just enjoy other people's pain, I think. But here's the thing. I saw a stat the other day. Mac Jones joins Andrew Luck and Dak Prescott as the only 3 quarterbacks with 5 wins, 10 or more touchdowns, and 2,000 yards in their first 9 games. Does he look legit to you?
Yeah, he's looking better, especially when you consider the fact that he doesn't have a lot of great weapons there.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Hunter Henry is a decent tight end, not great. Who's their wide receiver? Jacoby Meyer, who's never caught a touchdown pass.
Yeah.
He looks composed. I like him. I didn't like that move that he made about see him twisting that guy's ankle. Kind of a shady move there. But as far as being a good quarterback go, yeah, I think they might have found their guy in the future. And there is talk that Odell Beckham might go there.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
There is. That might help him a little bit. But, hey, that's just the Patriots' way. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying.
Oh, wow.
But as good as he's been, you can't start him in fantasy. He's 21st in fantasy points, has only had 1 top 12 weekly finish, and the Browns have a fairly good defense. So I would sit him. He's fun to watch. I'm rooting for him, and I do hope that he gets some weapons. But no fantasy value there. I would avoid that. As far as the running backs go, Damian Harris is the guy. Start him. He had a slow start to the season, but despite that slow start, he's 16th in running back scoring. He's got 6 touchdowns in the last 5 games, and he's a safe bet to get you 15 to 20 touches. You got to play this guy. Now, I know what a lot of people are thinking. Ramondre Stevenson had a good game last game. In fact, he was more efficient than Harris, but I would still sit him. I think that he's going to slowly kind of gain a role in that offense, but for me, this is Harris's offense. I don't know if you'd agree about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, he struggled a little bit last game, but he's been a very good back.
We also have to realize they won big last week, did they not? And I think a lot of that comes down to giving extra touches to their backup, young, developing running back in those games that they can afford to do that. As far as the wide receivers go, and you mentioned it earlier, you need to sit all Patriots wide receivers. Their number one fantasy scorer this year is Jacoby Myers, who has not scored a touchdown in his entire career. That's got to tell you everything you need to know. You got to start Hunter Henry, though, at tight end. He's been an especially great standard tight end. In fact, he's found the end zone in 5 of his last 6 games. Play Hunter Henry as a tight end 1. You also got to start Nick Folk. He is the number 1 kicker in fantasy scoring this year. And as far as the Patriots defense goes, I think you should play them this week. They have scored 12, 13, and 20 fantasy points over their last 3 games. Now they play a Browns team that is really banged up. We're going to talk about that in a second. But man, the poor Browns have got to be, they're right up there with the 49ers as far as injuries that have crippled their team. So let's talk about it. Nick Chubb, as far as we know right now, Adam Schefter reported that Nick Chubb tested positive for COVID-19, which means he's going to need 2. He is vaccinated, so he will need 2 negative tests, and then he can come back. But let's be honest, at this point, it seems very unlikely that he is.
Yeah, 2 negative tests with 24 hours in between. So
yeah, with 24 hours in between. Pretty straightforward. What do you think the odds are that Nick Chubb plays this week?
I say it's pretty low, and I don't think they're going to rush him back because they got a lot of confidence, the guy that you're about to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hunt is on the IR. Chubb won't be playing this week. They're going to play Dearness Johnson. And Dearness Johnson, in his last game, that was week 7, was the last time he was the only running back in that backfield. They went against the tough Broncos defense, and he ran for 146 yards, and he scored a touchdown. He was super dominant. He was very good. Now, the Patriots have only allowed 3 touchdowns to running backs all year, so this is a tough matchup. But based off of volume and how effective he has been, I still think you need to play Dearness Johnson this week.
Yeah, I think the key to that, obviously it's good to have a good running back, but that Browns offensive line is an amazing offensive line, probably the best run blocking offensive line in the league. So here's when you come down to the unmovable object or the unstoppable force. Who wins? And I think that the Browns are going to be able to get some push there. And I think you have a decent week. I don't think he's going to have a great week, but
yeah, absolutely. So I would start him. And again, if Chubb plays, you're going to start Chubb, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I'd probably give it like a 5% chance. As far as the wide receivers go, here's the thing. I'm just going to say it. I think you need to sit Landry and Peoples-Jones. Landry was a bust last week. 3 catches for 11 yards. He hasn't scored a touchdown all year, and he's averaging under 10 fantasy points a game. He just hasn't been productive. Well, what about Peoples-Jones? He's had some big games. In fact, he scored 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games, but he had just 3 targets for 2 catches last game. And now you play the Patriots, allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to receivers. I don't know about you guys, and I don't know about you, Rob. Do you really feel comfortable starting either of those guys in this matchup?
No, not at all.
So I'm going to sit David Njoku. He's averaging just over 2 catches a game. He has had a couple of big performances. He did have a touchdown last game, but he is really touchdown dependent for a guy who has only scored in 2 games this year.
Yeah, this game it reminds me a lot of an old school game. I think you're going to see a lot of running the ball, good defense, low scoring, kicking field goals. I suspect that's what's going to be. And here's the thing about that game is that both of those teams are contenders. For all the struggles that the Browns have had right now, all the injuries, they're actually right in the cusp of making the playoffs, so we're starting today. So
yeah, if injuries didn't exist, if this were Madden and you could turn injuries off, you have to think the Browns are the best team in the NFC North. They have been surprisingly good throughout injuries to their quarterback, their running backs, drama with their wide receivers, and injuries to the other wideouts. It's been really impressive. Finally, I would sit their kicker and sit the Browns defense. It's that simple. If you don't trust the offense, it's hard to trust the kicker there.
Once again, man, we love that you guys watch our videos. We appreciate any comments you would have on there, any questions, concerns. Please feel free to put it on there. We'd love to answer that for you. Once again, subscribe, like, comment, and thanks once again for joining us at the FFP. God bless and take care.